Joining us now is an excellent man in the U.S. Senate, one of the few, Senator Eric Schmitt from the great state of Missouri. Senator, welcome to the program. There has been a lot of drama recently around Senate confirmations, including Pete Hegseth. What would you give Pete Hegseth's chances of now being confirmed, and walk us through some of the events of the last week?
I think he's got a great chance. And I think the vibes are strong. I met with him last week. I'm on the Armed Services Committee. Pete's a great pick, and you look at the sort of the electrical cord that runs across all of these picks, Charlie, you've talked about it a bunch, is that they're all disruptors. They're all reformers. President Trump ran on this. He talked about it for well over a year. He held rallies all across the country. He talked about disrupting the status quo in Washington, and that's exactly what he's doing with these picks. Our conversation centered around reforms within the Pentagon. We've got to be nimbler. We got to be smarter. One of the big advantages we've always had against our adversaries like China is that we're innovators and China copies. Well, if you have a Pentagon that's completely, this bureaucratic mess, we're not going to innovate very well moving forward. He talked about that, eliminating DEI once and for all in the Pentagon. We've got some wins. I've sponsored at a hiring freeze, but you really need somebody at the top to lead that cultural kind of change to get back to war fighting, and instead of all these social experiments, this racist DEI. So he's a smart guy. He's going to do a great job, and I think he's going to get through. I think, honestly, they're all going to get through because senators, I think, appreciate it. I hope they do. It's certainly something I talk about. President Trump won with that mandate. He won the popular vote. He swept the battleground states. It's unprecedented. It's the greatest political comeback in American history, and he deserves to have a team around him that wants to execute on his vision.
So Senator, there's some whispers that the NDAA, which is this big bloated thing that gets passed, could potentially tie Pete Hegseth's and Doge's hands. Educate our audience on what the NDAA is. Do you guys need to pass it as this monstrosity before we add a couple more Senate seats and take the majority? Please walk us through the details on the NDAA.
Yeah, so the NDAA is the National Defense Authorization Act. It's passed every year and essentially authorizes how we allocate resources to protect our country, right? So, what do you want to spend money on? Are you spending money on, the Air Force for this, or are you spending money for the Navy for that? We have real challenges right now. I'll tell you, China has a bigger Navy than we have. It's not a better Navy, but it's a bigger Navy. We've got supply chain issues. We got production problems. And so the NDAA is sort of a statement on the things that we care about as relates to our national defense. It's about $800 billion a year. That's what it is this year. And so it's something we do. I think there's a lot of big wins in this NDAA as relates to DEI, getting rid of some of this censorship enterprise that was embedded by the Biden administration. But we're going to crack at this next year. And my hope is that we have an administration, and we will, that's very much reform-minded. But the NDA is something that every year we sort of put our stamp on. What are our priorities as it relates to the national defense? And I did talk to Pete about that. I think he's coming in. And what I would say is, and this to be true, I know the audience will know this to be true, the legislative branch plays a very important role with appropriating and oversight, but you have to have true believers leading those organizations. It's the reason why we got into this goofy DEI stuff in the first place. It was political. It was meant to send some sort of virtue signal. It's hurt recruiting. The Navy's recruiting is down. They fired over 6,000 well-qualified men and women from the armed forces because they refused to get the COVID shot. I mean, this stuff is nuts. So you really do need leadership that's going to change it culturally beyond just any legislation that we would pass or not pass.
So there were some whispers last night. I don't need to get too deep into this, but that Schumer is doing some last minute stuff to try to protect the National Labor Relations Board from Trump. They can file cloture. They can force it through. I know that it's a kind of a wonky thing. I want you just to comment on that. But more broadly, I mean, we are now 3 weeks out from the Senate majority flipping because it happens on January 3rd. What last minute sneaky things do we have to be worried about from Chuck Schumer in the United States Senate?
Yeah, the good news is we're only here for the rest of this week and next week. So there's a limited amount of time for Chuck Schumer to do shenanigans. I think we're about done. I think we kind of know the federal judges that he's going to appoint. He's got a limited number he can do on the district court level. There's not going to be any more circuit level, meaning appellate judges. That's a win. There's like 4 more that President Trump's going to get when he comes in, because they have their own attendance issues. But we got to make sure we show up. The NLRB stuff is a great example. These are 5-year positions. It's a 5-member board that decides a lot of potential disputes between business and labor, and might have a role to play, quite frankly, with when President Trump wants to come in and have a reform agenda. And if you're not willing to show up to work, you probably shouldn't have a job in this town, right? So this is an important board. It's important, I think, that we try to knock these people out. I'm not going to support either one of them. Those votes are coming this week, but we've got to, if to the extent we can beat them. We don't have the numbers if everybody shows up, but you don't know that until everybody shows up. We got to all vote no on these, I think, to sort of beat this back.
Yeah, you got some bitter Democrats. John Tester just might not show up. I mean, you got some guys that, literally John Tester's telling reporters, I want to get the hell out of here, right? And so he's feels forgotten in some ways. Sherrod Brown. So you don't know that, right? It's just you don't know who actually might show up and who won't.